One quiet evening as Michael Johnson was walking home, a random police check suddenly stopped him. The officer, with a look full of prejudice, demanded that he stop without providing a clear reason. Michael chose to remain silent, allowing himself to be unjustly searched, knowing that the only reason he was stopped was because of the color of his skin. However, just a few days later, a recording that shook the entire city was released, revealing an undeniable truth. Don't forget to subscribe now and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. It was a quiet evening in New Haven. The city, usually bustling with life during the day, had slowed to a peaceful stillness as the night settled in. The faint glow of streetlights illuminated the empty streets, casting long shadows and creating an atmosphere of tranquility. It was the kind of evening where few could anticipate the storm that was about to erupt. The door to the law office clicked shut behind Michael Johnson, the sound echoing softly in the otherwise silent street. Michael, a man in his 50s, dressed in a sharp black suit, stepped out of the office. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, the kind that only comes with years of hard work and experience. His briefcase, heavy with legal documents, swung gently by his side as he began walking down the wet pavement. Although the day had been long and stressful, Michael's mind was not at rest. He was thinking about his cases, complex, challenging cases that always seemed to bring him face to face with the darker side of the law. Yet, he never imagined that on this particular night he would find himself at the center of an unforeseen story. As he walked, Michael passed an intersection, and the flashing red and blue lights of a police car suddenly illuminated the street. The lights flickered briefly across his face, and he squinted into the glow, instinctively pausing. A sinking feeling began to form in his stomach. Two figures emerged from the vehicle, their silhouettes growing clearer as they approached him. Michael had learned to ignore the judgmental stares he often received, especially when walking alone through empty streets at night. It was something he had come to expect, but tonight the unease he felt was different. There was something off about the way the officers were approaching him, something that made his skin prickle with discomfort. The police car stopped directly in front of him, the engine rumbling to a halt. The officers stepped out, one of them larger than the other. The senior officer, Officer Carter, was a bulky man with a rough face and eyes sharp enough to cut through steel. His partner, Officer Reed, looked younger and less certain, shifting uneasily beside him. "Evening," Officer Carter said, his voice cold and unfriendly. Michael straightened up, nodding slightly in greeting as he replied in a calm but firm tone, "I'm just heading home. I'm a lawyer, just finished up at the office." Carter didn't respond immediately. He simply studied Michael, his eyes scanning him from head to toe, as if looking for something suspicious. Officer Reed stood slightly behind, his eyes flicking nervously between his partner and Michael. "Is that so?" Carter finally said, his gaze still fixed on Michael. "We got a call about a robbery in the area. You fit the description of the suspect." Michael froze. A robbery? He had just left his office. He couldn't be involved in something like that. He had lived in New Haven for years, and in all that time he had never encountered anything like this. "A robbery?" Michael asked, his voice remaining steady, though his patience was beginning to thin. "I'm a lawyer. I can show you my papers and documents. I haven't done anything wrong." Carter smirked, his expression filled with disdain. "Documents, huh?" He chuckled derisively. "I bet you wouldn't be surprised if I took a look inside that briefcase of yours." Michael's frustration started to bubble up. "It's just legal paperwork. You don't have the right to search it without a warrant," he said, his voice sharp. But Carter was undeterred. Without another word, he reached out and grabbed Michael's briefcase, yanking it from his hands. Michael stood frozen as Carter opened it without asking for permission. The documents inside spilled onto the ground as Carter rifled through them, his actions deliberate and dismissive. "Oh, I see," Carter muttered, his voice laced with mock surprise. "Seems like someone's trying a little too hard to look innocent. What's he hiding, I wonder?" A surge of anger coursed through Michael's veins. This wasn't just harassment. It was a blatant violation of his rights. "This is harassment," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I demand that you stop this right now. "Demand, huh?" Carter sneered. "We're the ones in charge here, not you." In that moment, before Michael could react, Carter stepped forward and roughly grabbed his arm, twisting him around. "Put your hands behind your back," he commanded. Michael's disbelief was growing. He couldn't believe this was happening. "You don't have any evidence. I haven't done anything wrong." His voice trembled with frustration. But Carter wasn't listening. He shoved Michael toward the police car, the officer's hands tightening on his arms, pulling him along like a criminal. Michael, seething with anger, struggled to process what was happening. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was something far deeper. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of confusion and rage as Carter slapped the cuffs on him. Michael knew that the officer was treating him this way solely because of who he was, what he looked like, and the assumptions Carter had made based on those superficial factors. When Michael was shoved into the back of the police car, the weight of the situation finally hit him. His heart pounded, not out of fear, but out of pure, unfiltered anger. He couldn't understand how, in this day and age, something so unjust was happening to him, a man who had worked tirelessly for years to fight for justice, all because of the color of his skin. As the car doors slammed shut, Michael made a silent vow to himself. This wasn't going to stand. He would not let this injustice slide. He would fight back. He had to. The New Haven police station took on a different atmosphere in the dead of night. The silence in the air was occasionally broken by the distant wail of sirens, but inside the station, all that could be heard were the heavy footsteps of officers and the muffled calls about unfinished cases. The stark fluorescent lighting cast a dull glow, illuminating the cold concrete walls and creating a sense of isolation. Michael Johnson was pushed into a small holding cell, the door clanging shut behind him. His eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light and he took in the barren room around him. The cell was cold, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and stale coffee, a mix that seemed to seep into every corner. There was only one metal chair bolted to the wall, a small table, and a wall that bore the cracks and marks of age. The room felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. He stood for a moment, absorbing the weight of the situation. His breaths came in shallow gasps as the reality of what was happening began to settle in. Michael sat down heavily on the chair, the chill of the metal seeping through his clothes. He closed his eyes briefly, trying to steady his thoughts. This wasn't just any ordinary night. It was a night that had already shattered everything he'd worked for. As a lawyer who had spent his entire life fighting for justice, he never imagined that he would find himself behind bars, accused of something he didn't do. And the reason? His race. He had always known that there was a dark undercurrent of prejudice in the world, but now he was its direct target. He had been arrested, thrown into a cell, and treated like a criminal, not because of his actions, but because of the assumptions someone had made about him. Memories of his encounter with Officer Carter and Officer Reed flashed through his mind. Carter's sneering face, the way he grabbed Michael's briefcase and flipped through it without a second thought. The words Carter had spoken echoed in his ears. "Looks like someone's trying a little too hard to look innocent." Those words had cut deeper than anything else. They weren't just an accusation. They were an attack on his very dignity. They were the kind of words Michael had heard all his life, the kind that had always made him feel like an outsider in his own country. Despite the sting of the insult, Michael kept his composure. He knew that in moments like these, emotions couldn't guide him. Anger would only fuel the fire. He had to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose control. If he did, his anger would be used against him. From outside his cell, Michael could hear Carter's footsteps echoing in the hallway, his voice cutting through the air with arrogance. "Nothing surprising here," Carter's voice rang out, dripping with condescension. "Another criminal off the streets. Think he's some high and mighty lawyer? Let him feel how fast the truth comes crashing down on him." Michael clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his chest. The fury inside him was growing, but he forced himself to breathe deeply. He had been through worse than this before. He had fought harder battles, but this felt different. This wasn't just about the case. It was about something much bigger, something personal. He couldn't let Carter and people like him continue to perpetuate this injustice. He knew he had to keep going, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged because of their race, their skin color, or their background. As Carter's footsteps faded away, Michael felt the sharp sting of the words, but instead of weakening him, it ignited something stronger. He was no longer just a man wrongfully imprisoned. He was a man with a purpose, a man with a responsibility to not only stand up for himself, but for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. He wasn't going to let this system win. He wasn't going to let the people who held power continue to oppress others with impunity. Outside in the hall, Officer Reed stood frozen, his eyes glued to the small window in Michael's cell. Reed hadn't said much since Michael's arrest, but now, as he watched the man in the cell, he felt a growing sense of discomfort. Reed was young, fresh on the job, and he had never been in a situation like this before. The world was black and white in his training, but reality was anything but. As he looked at Michael sitting there, calm despite the unfairness, Reed couldn't help but feel a deep unease. He hadn't spoken up when Carter had shoved Michael into the car, and now, seeing the injustice in full force, he realized how wrong it all was. Reed looked down the hallway toward Carter's office where his superior was talking with other officers. A part of Reed wanted to speak out, to confront Carter, to make things right, but the other part of him, the part that had only been in this line of work for a few years, was paralyzed by fear. He knew what would happen if he stood against Carter. His career, his future, everything he had worked for could be on the line. But in that moment, as he stood there in the silence of the night, Reed realized that silence had its own price. The longer he stood by and did nothing, the more he felt like a part of the machine that perpetuated the very injustice he had sworn to fight against. Maybe I could do something, Reed thought to himself, his fingers tightening around the edge of the wall. But before he could decide what to do, he heard Carter's voice echoing in the hallway again, and Reed quickly turned away, forcing himself to focus on his duties. Meanwhile, back in the cell, Michael was still sitting, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The sting of the injustice was sharp, but it didn't paralyze him. No, it fueled him. Every moment he spent behind these bars was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. He wasn't just sitting in a cell. He was part of a bigger story. And this story wasn't going to end here. Michael knew that once he was free, he would have to take the fight to a new level. This wasn't just about one man's freedom. It was about a system that needed to be dismantled, rebuilt from the ground up. He wasn't going to let those like Carter who used their power to tear others down go unchecked. He would fight. He would fight until every last shred of injustice was eradicated, no matter what it cost him. The days following Michael's arrest were a blur of restless nights and relentless work for Sarah. As Michael's longtime assistant, she knew the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about exposing the flaws, the biases, and the deep-rooted prejudices that had led to Michael's unjust treatment. Sarah had always believed in the power of justice, but now she was determined to prove it by gathering irrefutable evidence to clear Michael's name. One morning, while Michael was busy preparing for the upcoming legal battle, Sarah woke early, ready to dive into her work. Her desk was already cluttered with piles of case files, witness statements, and legal briefs. She sat down in front of her computer screen, scanning the documents with precision. Among the papers were reports about the case, interviews with potential witnesses, and various pieces of information that Sarah had painstakingly gathered from every possible source. The pressure was mounting, but Sarah was resolute. She wouldn't rest until she had found the crucial evidence that could turn the tide. Her first task was to go through the recordings from the patrol car used by Officer Carter on the night of Michael's arrest. Sarah knew that the key to unraveling Carter's lies lay in these tapes. If she could uncover something that showed Carter's blatant manipulation of the situation, it could be the breakthrough. She listened to the tapes over and over, her ears tuned to every word, every nuance in the officer's tone. And then, there it was. A chilling moment in the recording that Sarah hadn't noticed before. Carter's voice was unmistakable, filled with venom as he spoke about Michael. "I don't see any reason to let him go. He's just another criminal. Whether it's true or not, we have to take him in. We can't let him get away." Carter's voice dripped with disdain. Sarah paused the recording, her heart racing. This was the smoking gun she had been looking for. Carter's words weren't just a confirmation of his prejudice. They were an explicit admission of guilt. But she knew that this one piece of evidence wasn't enough to convince anyone. It was crucial, yes, but Sarah needed more. She needed to find something that would show just how deeply Carter's bias ran. With renewed determination, Sarah went straight to Michael's office to gather additional evidence. She called the security department in the area where Michael had been arrested, requesting access to the video footage from the surveillance cameras. After what seemed like an eternity, Sarah received the footage she'd been waiting for. When she reviewed the video, it confirmed everything Michael had said. He was not near the scene of the robbery at the time it occurred. The footage showed Michael leaving his office, walking down the street in the opposite direction of the crime. He was miles away from where the incident took place. The video was clear, the timing was irrefutable, and it aligned perfectly with Michael's account of the night. This was the concrete proof Sarah needed to back up their defense. But Sarah didn't stop there. She wasn't about to leave any stone unturned. She began reviewing Officer Carter's previous arrest reports, something that had always intrigued her. At first, the reports seemed routine, but as Sarah examined them more closely, a disturbing pattern emerged. Carter had a history of describing black suspects in ways that suggested they were dangerous, often without any concrete evidence. These descriptions weren't just vague, they were racially charged, painting every black suspect as a potential threat. The reports were rife with language that betrayed Carter's deep-seated racial bias. His assumptions about black people, about their potential for criminality, were evident in every report. This was the evidence Sarah needed to show that Carter wasn't simply acting on a hunch or making an honest mistake. He was acting out of prejudice. Sarah quickly gathered the relevant pages and sent them over to Michael's legal team. The more pieces of the puzzle she collected, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just about clearing Michael's name. It was about taking down a man who had used his position of power to target and intimidate those he deemed suspicious. It was about revealing the cracks in a system that allowed bias and discrimination to thrive. Throughout the process, Sarah worked tirelessly. She didn't sleep much, often poring over documents late into the night, chasing down leads and speaking to witnesses. One of the witnesses, a local shopkeeper who had been in the area when Michael was arrested, came forward with a crucial piece of testimony. He confirmed that Michael was indeed far away from the crime scene and had not been involved in any suspicious activity. Slowly but surely, the evidence was stacking up in Michael's favor, but there was still a nagging worry in the back of Sarah's mind. Even with all this evidence, would it be enough to sway the court? The thought of presenting this in court, of ensuring every piece of evidence was delivered with precision, made Sarah's stomach churn. She knew that if any part of the presentation went awry, the entire case could fall apart. She had to get it right. There could be no mistake. After days of preparation, Sarah felt ready. She compiled a comprehensive summary of all the evidence she had gathered, the audio recordings, the security footage, and the incriminating arrest reports. She made sure every detail was documented and organized in a way that would make it impossible for anyone to deny the truth. The time had come to present everything to Michael. When she finally met with him, Sarah handed over the stack of documents with a deep breath. Michael looked at the materials in front of him, his eyes scanning the pages with growing relief. His shoulders, which had been tense for days, relaxed slightly as he reviewed the evidence. The weight of the situation still hung over him, but seeing everything Sarah had gathered gave him a sense of hope. "Sarah, thank you," Michael said, his voice full of gratitude. He looked up at her, his expression softening. "You've done more for me than I could ever have asked. Because of you, we can face Carter and the system head-on." Sarah smiled, though she knew the battle was far from over. This was just the beginning. She had done her part. But now it was time to make sure that all of this evidence would be presented in the best possible light in court. She couldn't afford to let anything slip through the cracks. For Michael's sake, and for the sake of everyone who had ever been unjustly treated by the system, she couldn't fail. As she left Michael's office, her mind raced with thoughts of the trial ahead. She had done everything she could, but now it was up to the court to recognize the truth. It wasn't just about clearing Michael's name, it was about holding the system accountable for its flaws and ensuring that no one else would have to face the same injustice Michael had. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to get more exciting videos. The next morning, the New Haven courtroom was filled with an undeniable tension. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air as people filtered into the room. Lawyers, reporters, and spectators all seemed to be holding their breath, aware that today was not just another day in court. Michael Johnson's case had become much more than a legal battle. It had turned into a confrontation between justice and injustice. Every eye in the room was on him as he entered. The reporters, the lawyers, the prosecutors, all of them watching him closely, some with judgment, some with curiosity. To them, Michael was either a hero or a villain, depending on where they stood. But no one could deny that Michael was about to face the fight of his life. Dressed in his signature black suit, Michael walked with quiet determination, his briefcase in hand, its weight symbolizing the responsibility he now carried. The weight of the law, of the truth, of everything he had fought for in his career. Today was going to be a defining moment, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a broken system. As he approached the defense table, Michael felt the eyes of the room following his every step. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, he set his briefcase down on the table with a soft thud and took a seat, his posture as straight as ever. Unlike the times before when he had sat nervously, now there was no trace of tension in his demeanor. He leaned back in his chair, gazing straight ahead, prepared for whatever came next. The prosecutor's table was where Officer Carter still sat, a picture of misplaced confidence. Beside him sat Patricia Reynolds, the district attorney, who had earned a reputation for her unwavering stance in court. They both eyed Michael with suspicion and judgment, but Carter's eyes, Michael noticed, were no longer filled with the sharpness they once had. Something had shifted. He could feel it. Carter knew that today wasn't going to go according to his plan, and the room settled into an uncomfortable silence as the judge entered and called the court to order. Michael stood up, his mind sharp and focused. His moment had arrived. He had prepared for this, and now was the time to speak. "Your Honor," Michael began, his voice calm yet powerful. "Today I stand before you not only to prove my innocence, but to expose the flaws, the lies, and the corruption within a system that I have spent my entire life defending." The weight of his words filled the room, and every eye was on him now. The tension became thicker, but Michael stood unwavering, his gaze steady and confident. "The accusations against me are baseless," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "They are the result of a deliberate attempt to deceive, to paint me as something I am not. As we've seen through the evidence I've presented, I was nowhere near the scene of the alleged crime when it took place. The security footage, the recordings from the patrol car, they all show the truth. But more than that, I'm here to show you something that can't be denied." Michael paused, letting the silence hang in the air. He slowly opened his briefcase, extracting a small CD, the crucial piece of evidence. He didn't rush. He wasn't afraid. He knew the truth was on his side. With deliberate precision, he placed the CD into the courtroom's audio system. As the recording began to play, the room fell into absolute silence. The voice that filled the room was unmistakable. Officer Carter's voice. Cold and ruthless. "There's no evidence against him, Reed," Carter's voice said, dripping with disdain. "But we're taking him in anyway. We can make up some evidence if we need to." The shock in the room was immediate. Michael's words had hit like a hammer, and the truth now hung in the air, undeniable. There was no escaping it. Carter had confessed to fabricating evidence, to planting a false narrative about Michael, simply because of who he was. "This is the confession of Officer Carter," Michael said, his voice steady but firm. "He knew I wasn't anywhere near the scene, but he chose to arrest me anyway. He decided to target me not because of any real evidence, but because of who I am, what I look like. He created a story to deceive this court, and now I'm here to make sure that story is exposed for the lie it is." The room was stunned into silence. The impact of Michael's words was immediate. The truth was now laid bare for everyone to see. Carter, who had been so sure of his power, was now visibly shaken. His confident facade cracked, and the anger in his eyes was palpable. But it was too late. The damage was done. Michael didn't stop there. He continued to lay out the evidence, piece by piece, exposing the manipulation that had been happening within the system. He showed how not only Carter but the entire legal framework had been compromised. He pointed out how Officer Reed, despite his inexperience, could no longer deny the truth. He could no longer sit by while an innocent man was wrongfully accused. Michael said, turning to the young officer, "You've seen this for yourself. You've been a part of something that's wrong, and you have the power to make it right. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been treated unfairly, who has been targeted for who they are. This system isn't working, and it's up to us to fix it." As Michael turned back to face the judge, his heart was pounding, but his resolve was unshaken. He had made his case. He had exposed the truth. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael felt a flicker of hope. He knew this moment could change everything. "What I want to say today isn't just for me," Michael continued, his voice gaining strength. "It's to show that a legal system built on lies, on manipulation, can be dismantled. We must stand up when we see injustice, not just for ourselves, but for all those who have suffered under the same weight. We have to do better. We can do better." The room remained silent. The weight of Michael's words was undeniable. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was defending the very essence of justice, and for a moment it seemed as though the whole room understood. The fight for fairness was not just about this one case, but about the larger fight to end discrimination, to end the corruption that had seeped into the system. The judge, who had remained quiet throughout the presentation, now turned his gaze to Carter. There was no mistaking it. Michael had won. He had not only defended his own innocence, but he had also exposed the truth, something that could no longer be ignored. Michael stood, his voice cutting through the tense silence of the courtroom. Every eye was on him as he rose to take his stand, and with a calm but unyielding tone, he addressed the court. "Your Honor, I call Officer Reed to the stand," Michael said, his gaze fixed intently on Reed. "I believe that with what he has witnessed and the pressure he has faced, he can help reveal the truth." The room was instantly focused on Officer Reed, who remained seated, stiff and uncertain, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of his seat. Reed, still young and only a few years into his career as a police officer, was caught in a moral struggle. Ever since the truth about Carter's actions had been exposed, Reed's conscience had been at war with itself. Though he had followed orders, the conflict within him had grown unbearable. With hesitation, Reed stood up, his legs shaky as he walked to the witness stand. He knew that what he said next could change everything. His words would not only affect the outcome of this trial, but could alter the course of his life forever. He took a deep breath, clenched his fists in determination, and faced the room, feeling the weight of the moment on his shoulders. "Your Honor," Reed began, his voice trembling slightly, "I am Officer Reed, and I admit that I was wrong." The courtroom fell silent, as if time itself had stopped. All eyes were on Reed, hanging on to every word he was about to speak. "I was told to arrest Mr. Michael Johnson by Officer Carter," Reed continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "But I had no evidence to suggest that he was guilty. Carter said we had to do it anyway. Someone had to be arrested, and since he said so, I went along with it. But now, after everything I've heard, after the evidence that has come to light, I know it wasn't right. I cannot stand by anymore. I must admit Carter was wrong. He manipulated the evidence and arrested an innocent man." The courtroom remained still, the impact of Reed's confession sinking in with heavy force. It was as if the truth had finally come crashing down, and the weight of it pressed heavily on everyone present. Michael's gaze never left Reed. He knew that Reed wasn't speaking out of malice, but out of a deep moral reckoning. Michael, however, wasn't done. This confession was a powerful step, but there was more to be said. The case at hand was about more than just one wrong arrest. It was about systemic issues, about the prejudices that had tainted the entire process. Michael knew it was time to address the larger issue, the one that few people were willing to face. He turned to the judge with a sense of purpose. "Your Honor," Michael said, his voice steady and resolute, "I request to present further evidence to show that Officer Carter's actions were not just a professional mistake, but a clear reflection of deep-seated prejudice and racism in how he enforces the law." The room seemed to tense further, and for the first time, Michael saw a flicker of concern in Carter's eyes. The once cocky prosecutor's mask of confidence began to crack. He couldn't hide the anxiety that was beginning to show, even though he tried to maintain his calm. Michael didn't pause. He continued, his voice growing firmer. "We cannot simply look at this as a case of one officer's error. We need to look deeper at how the system operates, at the harmful attitudes that persist within it. And Officer Carter is the prime example of how racism has infected the very institution meant to protect us." Michael walked to the display board, where he had prepared the next round of evidence to be shown to the court. He clicked a button and the screen lit up, displaying images, notes, and audio recordings, each piece meticulously gathered to shed light on the reality of Carter's actions. The first audio clip played, a recording of a conversation between Carter and a former colleague. The words were unmistakable and the hatred in Carter's voice was undeniable. "They never change," Carter's voice echoed through the courtroom, filled with contempt. "I don't see any reason to let them off. We have to show strength or they won't know fear." A shocked silence fell over the courtroom. The words hung in the air, stark and revealing. This wasn't just a random outburst. This was a clear reflection of Carter's deep-rooted bias. It wasn't just about the case at hand, it was about how Carter viewed an entire group of people simply because of the color of their skin. Michael didn't stop there. He presented further documentation, more arrest reports that Carter had filed over the years. In these reports, Carter consistently described black suspects as dangerous or untrustworthy without any evidence to justify these assumptions. "His reports, Your Honor," Michael said, turning to face the judge, "are not just examples of poor judgment. They are a direct reflection of institutional racism within the police force. And I believe these biases were the very reason why Officer Carter acted as he did, disregarding the truth and fabricating a case against me." Carter's composure was cracking now. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Michael saw his desperate glances toward his lawyers for some kind of help. But it was too late. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no way to cover it up. Michael pressed on, his voice unwavering. "The cost of such prejudices is high. Not just for victims like me, but for all of us. We cannot continue to accept a system where someone can be judged based on their skin color, where their fate is decided not by the facts but by the biases of those in power." In the back of the courtroom, Reed shifted his weight, the guilt of his inaction weighing on him. He glanced at Carter, then back at Michael, and the internal conflict he had been carrying for so long seemed to reach its peak. Reed could no longer stand in silence, no longer be a passive participant in this injustice. Michael turned to the judge once more, his eyes sweeping over the room. "We cannot stay silent any longer. If we refuse to face the truth, if we continue to let these injustices go unchecked, then nothing will ever change. I stand here not just to prove my innocence, but to demand change. For me, for everyone who has ever been mistreated, and for a system that needs to do better." The room was eerily quiet. Everyone understood the gravity of what had just been revealed. Michael had not just fought for his own freedom, he had fought for something much larger, something that went beyond the courtroom and into the very core of the society that had allowed these wrongs to persist. The fight for justice had just begun, but Michael had taken a powerful step forward. After days of tense battles in the courtroom, the final verdict was clear. Michael Johnson, the man once falsely accused and manipulated by a broken legal system, had triumphed. All charges against him were dropped, and Officer Carter, who had tried to fabricate evidence, was fired from the police force. However, Michael's victory wasn't just the victory of a man who had been proven innocent. It was the triumph of a man who had seen the truth uncovered, who had witnessed justice being served in an imperfect society. As Michael stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight bathed his face, casting a warm glow that reflected his resilience and unwavering faith in justice. Though he could smile at this personal victory, his mind couldn't fully relax. He knew this was just the beginning. The system he had fought so hard against was still deeply flawed, and it needed to change. One personal victory couldn't fix everything, and Michael understood that he needed to keep fighting for a fairer, more just society. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters had gathered. Cameras and microphones were raised, eager to capture the pivotal moment of Michael's life. Everyone wanted to hear his story of perseverance, of fighting against injustice, and of his belief in a better world. As Michael walked into the midst of the crowd, all eyes turned toward him. But instead of launching into a loud victory speech, he simply stood still, his gaze drifting into the distance, as if he were pondering the road ahead. Michael took a deep breath before he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang out, calm yet powerful in the stillness. "I stand here today not just because I won. I stand here because I know that this victory is not mine alone. It belongs to all of us." The reporters scribbled furiously, but no one could take their eyes off him. Michael continued, "We have witnessed abuse of power, racism, and manipulation within our system. I'm not the first to face these things, and I surely won't be the last. But today, I can stand here and say that if we don't take action, this injustice will continue." The crowd went silent for a moment, and then murmurs spread, the weight of Michael's words settling over the group. He continued, his tone steady but resolute, unaffected by the weight of the attention on. "We need change, real change, not through hatred, not through revenge, but through compassion. We cannot continue to foster racism and hatred. Instead of facing each other with animosity, we must face one another with understanding, with compassion, and with a willingness to help. We need to build a society where everyone is treated equally, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or the color of their skin." Michael didn't stop there. His gaze swept across the crowd, his words lighting a spark of hope in those who were listening. "We may not change the world overnight, but we can start by changing ourselves. Every small action, every kind word, every helping hand can make a difference. And if all of us commit to doing this, I believe that change will come. Because change is not some distant dream. It's something we create, moment by moment, action by action." At this, the crowd fell into a hush. It wasn't just the reporters now, but everyone standing there, from passers-by to witnesses in the trial. They were all captivated by his words. They weren't just hearing a man who had won a legal battle. They were hearing a man calling for change, for a revolution in how we treat one another, how society views and confronts injustice. "This is not just my story," Michael said, his voice growing stronger. "This is the story of everyone who has suffered from discrimination, from injustice, from oppression in this society. We cannot allow racism to continue poisoning our world. We must stand up, not just to protect our own rights, but to protect the rights of others, those whom society has forgotten. We must act for justice, for equality, and for the human values that we all share." The crowd remained still, silent, not just because of Michael's words, but because they knew these were not just empty words. Michael wasn't just talking, he had acted. He had stood up, fought, and won, not just for himself, but for others, for those whom society had ignored. As he had said, change begins with each individual. When Michael finished speaking, applause erupted. The sound wasn't just one of support for him, but of support for the powerful message he had shared. Michael's story wasn't just about winning a court case. It was about creating a society where racism no longer had a place, and where compassion and mutual aid would serve as the foundation for the future. Michael looked out at the crowd, a wave of hope swelling in his chest. He knew the road ahead would be long, but he also knew that if everyone in society acted for justice and equality, change was inevitable. It was no longer a question of if it would happen, but when. As he stood there in the midst of the crowd, Michael realized that this moment wasn't just his victory. It was a victory for all who had been overlooked, dismissed, or oppressed. It was a victory for anyone who believed in a better, fairer world. And with that victory, the movement for change had truly begun. Hit the subscribe button and don't forget to leave a comment so I can hear your thoughts and suggestions for future videos.